The Shadow General, an American epic of espionage, freedom, and betrayal. What if the ultimate triumph of American liberty, the surrender at Yorktown, was not won by muskets and cannon, but by a lie whispered in the ear of the most feared British general, a lie delivered by a man the nascent republic still considered property? His name was James. To the British, he was a loyal, simple spy. To George Washington, he was the invisible hinge upon which the future of the Revolution turned. His is the astonishing true story of how a slave slipped through the British lines, played the role of a double agent, and personally engineered the defeat of the mightiest army on earth, only to face a new, devastating battle for his own freedom once the smoke cleared. You think you know how America was won? You don't know James Armistead. Chapter 1. The Invisible Man. A Narrative Beginning. The heat of 1781 Virginia was a wet, suffocating blanket that clung to the sweat-soaked linen of British uniforms and the coarse homespun of the enslaved. For James, born into this sticky bondage on the Armistead plantation near New Kent, the heat was just another layer of oppression. He was 20, strong, and possessed a preternatural ability to observe without being seen, a trait often mistaken for simple-minded docility by the white world. It was this very invisibility that made him perfect for the mad proposition offered by the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette, a young, fiery French nobleman fighting for the American cause, looked at James not as a piece of property, but as a mind. James, Lafayette had said, his accent thick but his conviction clear. General Washington is being hunted. Cornwallis is a phantom, slipping through Virginia. We need to know his every move, his plans, his vulnerabilities. You, with your access, your shadow, can do this. James hadn't hesitated. Freedom was the unspoken promise, the silent contract sealed between the French aristocrat and the American slave. His mission was simple in its articulation, suicidal in its execution. Infiltrate the camp of General Lord Cornwallis, the commander of all British forces in the South, and report his findings back to Lafayette. James walked away from the American lines, his head bowed. He knew how to look like he was running away. He knew the script of a runaway slave seeking British protection, the lure of emancipation offered by the Crown to anyone who would fight the rebels. He didn't run far. He found the British camp outside of Richmond. He approached a sentry, breathless and feigning distress. "I know where the rebels are moving their supplies," he gasped, playing the part of a man eager to trade information for safety. The British officers, steeped in the ingrained arrogance of their superiority, saw only an asset of the lowest order, a former slave seeking favor. They missed the sharp, calculating mind behind the wide, fearful eyes. They hired him instantly, not as a spy to report on the Americans, but as a guide and mole, a man to sniff out information and lead their patrols. His new master was General Cornwallis himself. James was now walking the halls of the enemy's power, listening to every casual word, reading every carelessly discarded map, and memorizing every troop movement. He was the invisible man, the perfect weapon in a war where the greatest battle was fought not with bayonets, but with information. The true work had just begun. He was about to become not just a spy, but a double agent, and the fate of the American Republic would soon rest squarely on his ability to lie convincingly to the greatest military mind in North America. Part 1. The Invisibility Cloak, 1777 to 1781. Focus: James's early life, the start of the war, his recruitment, and the establishment of his double agent persona. Chapter 1 through 10. The Plantation and the Promise. Detailed life as a slave on the Armistead plantation near New Kent. The arrival of Lafayette in the colonies. The ideological spark. Lafayette and Washington's desperate need for intelligence in Virginia. the dangerous personal negotiation for James's freedom. Chapter 11 through 25, Crossing the Line. The meticulous planning of James's defection, the narrative of the loyalist slave he must sell to the British, infiltrating the British camp and establishing credibility. Introduction to General Cornwallis and Benedict Arnold, the notorious turncoat. Chapters 26 through 40, The Two Masters. Detailed accounts of James's movements, gathering British information, routes, supply depots, and intentions, and reporting them back to Lafayette through a complicated coded network of messengers. The incredible risk of his daily life. Part 2, The Great Deception. 1781, The Road to Yorktown. Focus. James's most crucial intelligence work, his direct manipulation of Cornwallis, and the ultimate setup for the decisive battle. Chapters 41 to 65, Hunting the Phantom. Tracking Cornwallis's movements across Virginia. James successfully guides British forces away from key American positions, making him seem invaluable to Cornwallis. Chapter 66 to 90, The Arnold Crisis. Benedict Arnold, now a British brigadier general, is tasked with raiding Virginia. James gains Arnold's complete trust and delivers deliberately false intelligence to him, costing Arnold key skirmishes and cementing James's reputation as a simple but devoted spy. Chapter 91 to 115, The Decisive Lie. James is asked by Cornwallis to spy on Lafayette's camp. James, knowing the exact plan, returns to Cornwallis with the real American troop strength, but convinces Cornwallis that Lafayette is aiming for a small inland post rather than Yorktown. Chapter 116 to 135, The Yorktown Trap. James delivers his final, fatal piece of intelligence to Cornwallis. Washington and the French fleet are not coming to Virginia, but are focused on New York. This lie is the primary reason Cornwallis consolidates his forces at Yorktown, sealing his fate as the Franco-American forces secretly converge. Part 3, The Siege and the Silence, 1781 to 1784. Focus, the Battle of Yorktown, the emotional aftermath, and the immediate, shattering return to bondage. Chapter 136 to 150, The Spy's View. James witnesses the siege of Yorktown from inside the British lines, his silent triumph as the Americans and French encircle the camp based on his intelligence, the emotional weight of seeing his master, Cornwallis, defeated. Chapter 151 to 165, The Handshake and the Chains. Cornwallis's surrender. James walks out of the camp a national hero in the eyes of Lafayette and Washington, but legally he is just a freed British asset. The devastating shock of being returned to the Armistead plantation. Chapter 166 to 180, The New War. The post-war confusion, the promise of freedom forgotten or delayed. James discovers that a 1783 Virginia law freeing slaves who fought was only for those who served as soldiers, not as spies or guides. He is legally a slave once more. Part 4, The Battle for a Name, 1784 to 1800s. Focus, the legal and political fight for James's manumission, the public outcry, and his lasting impact. Chapter 181 to 195, Lafayette's Return. Lafayette, disgusted by the betrayal of his promise, writes a personal, powerful letter to the Virginia General Assembly on James's behalf. The content of this letter, written by Lafayette himself, is James's only legal defense. Chapter 196 to 210, Free at Last. The political maneuvering and debate in the Virginia General Assembly, led by prominent American founders. The emotional trial. James is finally granted his manumission in 1787. He takes the name James Armistead Lafayette to honor the Frenchman who fought for his freedom. Chapter 211, Epilogue. The Man and the Myth. James Armistead Lafayette's later life as a free farmer, raising a family in Virginia.
his quiet life juxtaposed with his unbelievable impact, the slow erosion of his story from the public narrative until modern historians rediscovered his crucial role.
The audition of simplicity. The British camp was a sprawling, arrogant monument to imperial confidence, a temporary town carved out of the Virginia wilderness. Tents of bleached canvas, hundreds of them, stretched across what had been a quiet field, now scarred by wagon tracks and punctuated by the smell of wood smoke, wet wool, and human waste. James was initially held in a small guarded area near the quartermaster's tents, treated with the casual indifference reserved for captured livestock or low-value informants. The first hurdle wasn't providing information, it was convincing the British officers that he wasn't an informant, but merely a man driven by basic fear and self-interest. His interviewer was Captain Francis Stapleton, a junior aide whose disdain for American rebels and anyone enslaved was evident in the slight downturn of his mouth. Stapleton carried a sheaf of papers and a heavy sense of self-importance. "So, James," Stapleton began, leaning back in his camp chair, using his name like a term of ownership. "You came to us from a rebel planter, a Mr. Armistead, was it?" James stood tall, but kept his gaze slightly lowered, adopting the posture of deference and wariness he had perfected since childhood. "Yes, sir, William Armistead," he confirmed, his voice flat, accenting the subservience. "He was getting mighty short on victuals, said the Frenchies were eating them out of house and home. And he hit me last week. I ain't looking for fighting, sir, just a safe place to work." This was the lie. He needed to present a motivation as simple and visceral as hunger and petty grievance. Intellectual or political motivations were dangerous. They suggested the capacity for complex planning, for espionage. Stapleton scribbled something. "You claim you saw rebel General Lafayette's forward camp near Elk Hill. What were they doing?" "Moving slow, sir, mighty slow." He paused, deliberately taking a moment to remember. "They got too many wagons. They were heading to that place where the creeks meet. They seemed like they were guarding their blacksmith tents more than anything." This detail was crucial. The American lines were moving slowly, and the mention of the blacksmith tents, a necessary, mundane, and uninteresting target, served two purposes. It gave a verifiable, low-value fact, and it reinforced his persona. A soldier would mention cannon placement. A scared runaway would notice the source of the loudest noise and the dirtiest work. "You didn't see any plans, any maps?" Stapleton pressed. "No, sir. I'm just a field hand. I don't know nothing about maps," he replied, with a slight nervous shuffle of his feet. He had to be careful here. Too much information, and he was a spy. Too little, and he was useless. He decided to offer something concrete and low risk. "But I did hear a whisper. One of the wagon drivers, a nasty fella named Moses, was complaining. Said they were waiting for a big delivery of saltpeter from Philadelphia. Said the gunpowder was running low." Saltpeter, a vital component of gunpowder. If the British knew the Americans were low on powder, they would feel confident pressing an attack. This piece of intelligence was true, but not vital enough to compromise the entire American operation. It was a well-crafted offering, a gift to establish trust. Stapleton's eyes finally showed a flicker of interest. "Saltpeter. Good. You'll wait here." The recruitment, from mole to guide. The real breakthrough came later that evening. James was brought before a small council of officers, a chilling assembly that included Captain Stapleton and a taller, more severe man introduced as Colonel Simcoe. Simcoe was a notorious commander, known for his ruthless counterinsurgency tactics. "General Cornwallis is looking for men like you, James. You know this wretched country. You know the back roads. We have enough fighting men. We need eyes and ears." Simcoe's proposition was calculated. They didn't want James to bring them written reports. They wanted him to become a trusted guide and occasionally a courier for high-ranking officers traveling under guard. This was perfect. As a guide, he would have unescorted access to areas where maps and dispatch riders were kept. As a courier, he would be privy to the conversations and routes of the top command. "We will pay you, James," Simcoe promised, a small bag of coins jingling in his hand. "More than your old master ever did. You will work directly for the general staff, bringing us intelligence on rebel movements and helping us navigate this swamp. You are now in the service of the king. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," James affirmed, accepting the coin. His heart was pounding a revolutionary rhythm against his ribs, but his face remained a mask of bovine acceptance. He was now officially a British operative, directly under the control of Lord Cornwallis's headquarters. He was the perfect, unassuming conduit for information. They had hired a spy to spy on the rebels, but James was about to turn the entire operation on its head. He wasn't just working for them. He was their weapon of self-destruction. The very next morning, he would be introduced to the man who would be his most useful and most dangerous contact. Major General Benedict Arnold, the American traitor, now wearing the uniform of the enemy.
The traitor's confidant. The air of the British High Command camp changed the moment Major General Benedict Arnold arrived. It wasn't just the increased security, it was the palpable tension, a mixture of grudging respect for his military acumen and outright contempt for his treason. To the British, he was a necessary villain. To the Americans, he was the symbol of ultimate betrayal. James, now outfitted in rough, clean clothes and officially listed on the quartermaster's roster as a guide and special courier, was directed to Arnold's personal encampment near Portsmouth. Lord Cornwallis, despite his distaste for Arnold, needed his ruthlessness to spearhead the raids across Virginia. And Arnold, having lived and fought among the rebels, needed someone who could reliably confirm the intelligence he received, someone like James. James's assignment was simple: make Arnold trust him implicitly. He found Arnold standing over a sprawling map on a makeshift table, his face a landscape of bitterness and ambition. Arnold was a study in conflicted power, his uniform pristine, yet his eyes held the haunted, suspicious look of a man who knew he could never return home. "You're the new guide, James?" Arnold didn't wait for an answer. His voice was a rasp, demanding immediate attention. "Yes, General. Ready to serve the king," James replied, adopting the slightly anxious but eager tone that had worked on Captain Stapleton. Arnold swept a hand across the map. "I need to know what Lafayette is planning. I know him. He's young, hot-headed, but he learns fast. His men are poorly supplied. I need routes to cut off his foraging parties. Where is the easiest place to hit him, James? Not the best place, the easiest place." This was a test. A simple answer wouldn't do. It had to be an Arnold answer, aggressive, tactical, and slightly cynical. James knew the American supply lines were indeed fragile. He couldn't lie completely, or Arnold would lose faith quickly. "If you go for the main road, General, you'll meet trouble," James advised, stepping closer and pointing with a deferential finger. "Lafayette's got small scouting patrols, boys mostly, near the James River crossing. But they guard the wagons carrying the medical stores close. They're afraid of the sickness, sir, more than the shot. They think a few wounded men are worth more than a whole wagon of powder." He gave Arnold a target that was militarily relevant, medical stores, but emotionally revealing, fear of sickness, appealing to Arnold's understanding of the American soldier's mindset. It was a perfect blend of truth and tactical distraction. Arnold looked up, his brow furrowed. He wasn't looking at a slave, he was looking at an intelligence source. Why would he prioritize medicine over munitions? "Rebel morale, General," James explained, his voice low and confidential.
When a man's fever breaks, he can still fight. When the wound festers, the whole company sees their end. Lafayette knows they run on hope. You hit the medicine, you don't just kill the wounded, you kill the hope of the rest. A slow, chilling smile spread across Arnold's face. Clever. Too clever for a field hand. Did Lafayette feed you that line? No, sir. I just know how a man thinks when he's cold and hurting. The Colonel Armistead, he used to complain the same way when his slaves got sick. It's expensive to lose a man to a fever. James brought the conversation back to the language of property and economics, the one language that transcended the war and made sense to both the planter and the avaricious trader. It was the key to his cover. His insights were observational, not strategic. The double bind is forged. The next few days were spent accompanying Arnold on short recon missions and detailed map reviews. Arnold was impressed with James's uncanny knowledge of the Virginia terrain, the forgotten paths, the dry creek beds, the locations of sympathetic Loyalist farmers. Arnold soon gave James a second, more dangerous task, to spy on the British for Arnold himself. Arnold was famously paranoid and often clashed with other British officers, especially those who were critical of his status as a turncoat. He wanted James to listen to the whispers in the officers' mess, to gather intelligence on his rivals within the British ranks, and report only to him. "You're going to be my private courier to the officers in Portsmouth," Arnold stated one morning. "You will deliver my dispatches, but before you hand them over, I want you to listen to what they say about me. And when you get back, you'll tell me what they are really planning, not what they write on paper." James's assignment was now perfectly inverted. He was now officially spying on the British Army, on the orders of a British general, all while secretly reporting everything to the Americans. The deep cover was secure, ironically, because of Arnold's own paranoia. He had become the trusted confidant of the most infamous traitor in American history. The true double-agent game was now afoot, placing him directly on the knife edge of discovery. He now held information that, if revealed, could save the American cause or cost him his life.
The path of the decoy. James's dual role as a private courier for Arnold and a trusted guide for Cornwallis's staff gave him unprecedented access. He was often carrying sealed dispatches, which he was forbidden to open, but the verbal briefings and casual conversations he overheard while waiting in the headquarters tents were a gold mine. His first opportunity to manipulate the British strategy came when Arnold began planning a major raid on American stores rumored to be amassed in the interior of Virginia, specifically near a village called Louisa Courthouse. Arnold was eager to score a decisive victory and demonstrate his worth to Cornwallis. One afternoon, while assisting Colonel Simcoe in charting routes, James overheard a discussion about the planned deployment of a large foraging party, about 500 men, meant to secure the route ahead of Arnold's main force. James knew that Lafayette had anticipated Arnold's movements toward the richer areas of central Virginia. Lafayette had strategically placed a small but seasoned detachment of Virginia militia near a key crossroads precisely to harass these foraging parties, but they were positioned slightly off the route the British were currently planning to take. This was James's moment. He needed to subtly guide the British party directly into the prepared American ambush. "Colonel Simcoe," James interjected casually, his eyes on the map, his fingers tracing a narrow, dusty line. "If the goal is speed and surprise for the Louisa raid, this road, the main road, is going to be wet. The spring rain swelled the creek near the Blackwood crossing. Wagons will sink past the axle, surely." He then pointed to a parallel, smaller trail, one that was barely marked. "There's an old tobacco path here, sir. It's drier, runs straight through the woods, and cuts nearly a half day off the trip, but it's narrow, only for men on foot and horse."
Simcoe, keen on efficiency and dismissive of the local intelligence given by a slave, scrutinized the map. The tobacco path did look shorter. "Is this path safe from the rebels?" Simcoe asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Safe? Sir, it ain't safe anywhere in this county," James replied with a low chuckle, a tone of local fatalism. "But the rebels, they think like soldiers. They'll be watching the big road, waiting for the wagons. They won't think to watch a goat path like this." The lie was perfectly tailored to Simcoe's arrogance. By appealing to the officer's desire for a clever tactical shortcut and his belief that the rebels were predictable, James had delivered the perfect misdirection. He had sold them on the goat path as the smarter, safer choice. The ambush and the messenger. 2 days later, the foraging party of 500 men, led by Major Butler, took the tobacco path. The result was precisely what James had orchestrated. The narrow path prevented the British from forming a proper battle line, forcing them to move in single file. They walked directly into the sights of Lafayette's strategically placed militia. It wasn't a defeat for the British, but a sharp, bloody skirmish. Major Butler lost dozens of men, and most of the foraging had to be abandoned. When the bedraggled survivors limped back into the main camp, Colonel Simcoe was furious. He called James in immediately. "That path was a trap, James," Simcoe roared, slamming his fist on the table. "A trap, sir? But that path has been used for 40 years to move tobacco. I swear, sir, I only meant to save time. Did the rebels get wind of the movement?" "They were waiting." "Then it must be the locals, sir, the planters. They talk, they see movement, they send their own people. The rebels don't need a spy when every farmer's boy is watching the roads." James skillfully deflected the suspicion away from himself and on to the general population, a tactic that only increased the British distrust of all Virginians, a helpful outcome for the Americans. Crucially, Major Butler, the commander of the ill-fated mission, had a different perspective. "He saved my life, Colonel," Butler interjected, nursing a bandaged arm. "The path was bad, but he kept telling us to look out for the creek, to move fast. If we had taken the main road, the whole force would have been hit by that cannon they had waiting there. James's path was narrower, but it took us away from the main threat." Butler's intervention was the final stroke of genius James needed. By performing a small act of true guidance mixed with his larger misdirection, he had created an ambiguity. To Simcoe, he was suspect but useful. To Butler, he was a near savior. James walked away not only unharmed, but with his reputation among the high command actually enhanced. He was now seen as a simple, good-hearted guide who was sometimes clumsy, but whose local knowledge was indispensable, and whose loyalty was proven by his immediate warning of the main road's dangers. He was now officially a proven asset, trusted enough to be given a much greater and much more deadly task: to deliver messages directly to Lord Cornwallis himself.
The hand of the general. The successful failure of the Louisa raid, where James's guidance was seen as both flawed and ultimately beneficial, solidified his place on the headquarters staff. Lord Cornwallis, a meticulous and pragmatic commander, understood the value of local intelligence, especially intelligence that came from a source despised by the rebels. A week after the skirmish, James was summoned, not by an aide, but by a detachment of the general's personal guard. He was led into a large, well-furnished tent, Cornwallis's mobile command center. Lord Cornwallis, Charles II, Earl Cornwallis, was a figure of quiet authority. He stood tall, dressed impeccably despite the rough conditions, and his gaze was sharp, devoid of the emotional suspicion that colored Arnold's eyes. He saw James not as a man, but as a crucial component in his strategy to crush the American rebellion in the South. "You are the guide, James," Cornwallis stated, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I understand you have intimate knowledge of this region. I will be dispensing with General Arnold's services shortly, My campaign is moving away from coastal raids and into a decisive strategy." James bowed his head. "Yes, my lord. I know the fields and the fences. I grew up here." "Good. Loyalty is a simple thing, James. We offer you protection and purpose. You offer us truth." Cornwallis tapped a polished finger on a map that covered nearly the entire table. Cornwallis then delivered the astonishing news that would define the rest of the war. "We are moving our primary forces towards the Chesapeake Bay. We need a defensible deep-water port. I need to consolidate my forces, secure a good position, and await reinforcements and supply ships from New York." This was the strategic move Lafayette and Washington had been praying for. Cornwallis was abandoning the successful, harassing raids inland for a fixed defensive position on the coast, a decision that would ultimately lead him to Yorktown. "I need you to scout 2 locations for me, one near Williamsburg, and a second smaller position near a tobacco port called York." Cornwallis released James with his assignment to travel ahead of the main army, observe the defensibility of the 2 locations, and assess the speed of Lafayette's reaction to the massive British movement. This was the most dangerous scouting mission yet, but it also placed the key to American victory directly in his hand. The double agent's report. James immediately realized the profound danger of Cornwallis's plan. If the British secured a strong, deep-water base like Yorktown, receiving constant resupply, the combined Franco-American army might never be able to dislodge them. He left the British camp under the guise of an extended scouting mission. He traveled not on the main roads, but through the deep woods, making contact with his designated American rendezvous point, a small hidden cabin used by a trusted patriot farmer. There he met with one of Lafayette's most reliable messengers, providing the intelligence that would shift the entire course of the war. "Cornwallis is done with the inland chase. He is heading for the coast. He is choosing between Williamsburg and a small port called York. He wants a base to receive the seaborne army from New York. This is not a retreat. This is a consolidation. Tell the Marquis he is waiting for the sea." Lafayette immediately understood the implications. If Cornwallis committed to a single fortified position on the coast, it would allow the American and French armies, led by General Washington and the French naval fleet under Admiral de Grasse, to converge and besiege the entire force if they could move fast enough. The double intelligence. James returned to Cornwallis's tent a week later, smelling of wood smoke and exertion, but bearing the false intelligence that would secure his trust forever. "The Williamsburg area is suitable, my lord," pointing out the existing fortifications. "But the port at York, it's smaller, easier to defend the land approach, and the cliffs overlooking the York River will be perfect for your big guns. Lafayette is tracking your movements, but he thinks you are heading towards Richmond again to raid the munitions depot. He is preparing his main force for a move north." He offered a fabricated report of Lafayette's intentions, a deliberate lie that told Cornwallis exactly what the British general wanted to hear, that his flank was safe and that the rebels were looking in the wrong direction. Cornwallis was satisfied. He patted James on the shoulder, a horrifyingly intimate gesture for a slave, but a sign of his complete approval. "You have done well. You have saved us weeks of confusion. York it is." The walls go up. The port of York, soon to be known to the world simply as Yorktown, was rapidly being transformed into a formidable fortress. The moment Lord Cornwallis moved his headquarters into the customs house, the entire perimeter was choked with the furious activity of engineering and defense. The objective was clear: hold the position, receive supplies, and repel any ground assault until reinforcements arrived from General Clinton in New York.
For James Armistead, the move meant a new, dangerous proximity to the center of British power. He was now quartered with the logistical staff, frequently running errands between the newly dug earthworks and the general's temporary office. The air was thick with the dust of freshly turned earth and the constant, rhythmic sound of axes clearing the field of fire. The most vital task for James was now twofold: to confirm that Cornwallis was fully committed to the defensive position, and to ascertain when and where the expected British naval resupply would arrive. Cornwallis's confidence was a palpable shield, but James noticed the growing anxiety among the lower-ranking officers. They complained about the position, landlocked on 3 sides, and the river offered too easy an escape if the French Navy ever gained control. This information, that the British felt trapped even while fortifying, was priceless to the Americans. One evening, while delivering late-night rations to a British artillery officer, James overheard a crucial detail. The officer, drunk and complaining about the strain, muttered about having to move the heavy guns back to the outer defenses because the general expects the naval fleet to anchor on the inner roadstead by the end of August. The date, the end of August. The location, the inner roadstead. This was the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. It meant the British fleet would be within the Chesapeake Bay, not just offshore. The final dispatch. James knew he could not risk carrying a written message. Security was too tight. Patrols were everywhere. He had to deliver the intelligence quickly and verbally, relying on his network. Under the guise of a pre-dawn foraging trip for fresh meat, a task only he, a local guide, could manage, James slipped away from the outer perimeter before the morning fog lifted completely. He raced 10 miles inland, reaching the safe house near the Chickahominy River, where he met his contact, a young American dragoon. The message he delivered was short, precise, and potentially world-changing. The fox is in the box. Cornwallis is fully committed to Yorktown. The walls are up, but his men feel exposed. He expects the British naval fleet and supplies from Clinton to arrive in force at the Chesapeake Bay by the end of August. The window is closing. Tell the Marquis, now is the time to strike the land and the sea. The dragoon rode off immediately, carrying the intelligence that would soon reach General Washington, who was, at that very moment, contemplating an attack on New York. James' intelligence, combined with Lafayette's confirmations, allowed Washington to make the most consequential decision of the war, abandoning the New York plan and marching his combined army rapidly south to Virginia. The shock of convergence. James returned to Yorktown before noon, carrying a few rabbits and an air of tired innocence. He had risked everything, but the message was delivered. Days turned into a week. Then, in the last week of August, 1781, James was standing on the fortified parapet overlooking the Chesapeake Bay when he saw it. It wasn't the red and white of the anticipated British fleet. Instead, the horizon filled with a vast, terrifying forest of masts bearing the white lilies of the French Royal Navy. Admiral de Grasse's fleet, over 20 dozen warships strong, had arrived. They sailed into the Chesapeake Bay, blocking the mouth of the bay and sealing off Cornwallis's only line of retreat and resupply. A stunned silence fell over the British command. James watched Cornwallis's face, usually so composed, twist into a mask of grim realization. The consolidation at Yorktown, which had felt like a strategic move, had instantly become an inescapable trap. The next sound James heard was not the lapping of waves, but a distant, muffled drumming, the sound of thousands of boots marching south. The armies of Washington and Rochambeau, having covertly slipped away from New York, were arriving to close the pincers on the land. The double agent had succeeded. He had delivered his master, Lord Cornwallis, straight into the waiting clutches of his true master, General Washington. The battle for America was about to be won, and James was standing directly inside the cage.
The hostage within the walls. The siege began not with a bang, but with a sudden, unnerving silence as the Franco-American armies, a staggering force of 17,000 men, completed their encirclement. On September 28, 1781, the combined forces began digging the first parallel trench, a vast, earth-scarred line that would inch them closer to the British defenses at Yorktown. For James, trapped inside the walls, the reality was a nightmare of psychological warfare. He was surrounded by men who trusted him implicitly, yet every shovel of earth thrown up by the enemy forces was a direct result of his successful deception. He was the most dangerous American asset in history, currently held hostage by his own success. The mood within the British camp shifted from strategic confidence to grim despair. General Cornwallis, realizing the full extent of the trap, sealed by de Grasse's fleet blocking the sea and Washington's army blocking the land, issued immediate drastic orders: conserve all food, ration all powder, and build the defenses higher. James, still running errands, saw the effects firsthand. He saw the proud British soldiers, the best the Empire had, pressed into back-breaking labor, their faces drawn with the realization they were marooned. His duties became more perilous. He was often sent to the outer redoubts, where cannonballs from the American and French siege artillery began to fall. The sound was deafening, the dirt and splintered wood flying everywhere. James maintained his simple, subservient demeanor, but his mind raced, calculating the trajectory of every shot, hoping the Americans were aiming true, yet praying they didn't hit his position. The interrogation of the courier. The greatest danger, however, came from the arrival of the captured dispatches. One afternoon, a British patrol ambushed an American courier carrying messages between Lafayette and Washington. The unfortunate courier was brought into Cornwallis's headquarters. James was cleaning boots outside the tent when he heard the familiar, sharp voice of Lafayette mentioned inside. He pressed close to the canvas, his heart hammering against his ribs. Cornwallis's voice was cold. This message speaks of a precise maneuver near the James River. The Marquis knows the route too well. How? An aide replied, "My lord, the courier says the intelligence came from a highly placed source within our command, a double agent, supposedly. He called himself Agent X." James froze. He had always used coded drops, never hearing the details of the intelligence reports that Lafayette sent up the chain. The name Agent X was a chilling reminder that his existence was known to his allies, but also potentially traceable by his enemies. "Find this Agent X," Cornwallis ordered. "Search every communication, every ledger, every man who was near me when the plans for Yorktown were drafted. Start with the local guides. They are the weakest link." James's knees felt weak. He was a local guide. He was the only local guide with continuous access to Cornwallis. He spent the next 48 hours in a state of terror, meticulously wiping away any sign of his private activities, forcing himself to appear even more slow-minded than before. He scrubbed floors, he polished brass, becoming literally invisible in a whirlwind of fear and activity. The intense scrutiny led to an incredible moment of irony.
Cornwallis, determined to find the high-ranking spy, became even more reliant on James's outward simplicity. Late one night, Cornwallis needed a dispatch sent to an outlying British redoubt. He trusted no one with the route through the darkening, artillery-pounded fields, no one except his unassuming slave courier, James. "Take this to Captain Leslie," Cornwallis commanded, handing James a sealed message. "And when you return, report what you see on the front. Do not be stopped." James ran the mile-long gauntlet under the light of the moon and the eerie illumination of flares. He delivered the dispatch, and on returning, he gave Cornwallis the detailed layout of the redoubt's weak spots, all while framing it as a simple topographical report. "The ground is softest on the left, my lord. The Frenchies are digging hard over there, and their lines are closer than the others." This innocent observation, a final piece of genuine, accurate military intelligence delivered by the supposed traitor, confirmed Cornwallis's belief that James was harmless and his intelligence source was elsewhere. James had convinced the most powerful man in the South that the spy was a high-ranking officer, not a piece of property. As the Americans tightened the noose, the artillery bombardment intensified. James watched the siege lines creep forward, one shovel of dirt at a time, knowing the final deadly blow was just days away. The walls were about to come crashing down.
He promise and the chain. The surrender of Lord Cornwallis on October 19, 1781, was one of the most solemn and symbolic moments in American history. As James walked the short distance across the ruined landscape of the battlefield, carrying the white flag and the message requesting terms, he felt the eyes of thousands of soldiers upon him. He was met at the American lines by an aide to General Washington, who took the note. James stood there, in the silence of the ceasefire, a British courier who was in fact the architect of the British defeat. The next day, James was tasked with being present near the final surrender field, the site where the British troops would lay down their arms. Cornwallis, unable to face the humiliation, feigned illness and sent his second-in-command, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, to surrender his sword. James watched from a distance as the defeated British columns marched out, their fifes playing a somber, if apocryphal tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." O'Hara tried to surrender his sword to the French commander Rochambeau, who correctly directed him to General Washington. Washington, equally resolute on protocol, delegated the acceptance of the surrender to his second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln. The aftermath of the surrender was a scene of unspeakable chaos and emotion. Amidst the jubilation, James was spotted by the Marquis de Lafayette. The young French general, flushed with victory, broke away from his entourage and strode directly towards James. Lafayette did not shake his hand. Such an action would have been unthinkable and dangerous for James in front of thousands of officers. Instead, Lafayette placed a hand firmly on James's shoulder, a gesture of respect that transcended rank and color. "James," Lafayette said, his voice husky with emotion and pride, "you have done it. Your intelligence, the certainty that Cornwallis was pinned, allowed us to bring Washington here. You have saved the revolution, James. You will have your freedom. I promise you this, on my honor as a soldier of France." James's eyes met Lafayette's, a look of profound relief and gratitude passing between the true co-conspirators of the victory. Moments later, General George Washington himself approached. He had heard James's story from Lafayette. General Washington, towering and grave, simply nodded to James. "The success of our plan," rested on the timely and accurate knowledge of the enemy's intentions, Washington stated, his deep voice carrying the full weight of his authority. Lafayette tells me you provided that knowledge, James. When the time for proper recognition comes, it will be done. James was now standing on the site of the greatest American victory, personally acknowledged by the two most powerful men in the New World as a hero. He felt the weight of his chains lift mentally and emotionally. He had fulfilled the contract. The war was over, and his prize was freedom.
The irony of liberty. The journey back to the Armistead plantation in New Kent County was the bitterest mile James had ever traveled. The fields he passed were no longer battlegrounds offering a path to freedom, but simply the land of his enslavement. The cheers of victory at Yorktown had been replaced by the silence of the post-war South, where the old order swiftly reasserted itself. When James reported back to Colonel William Armistead, his master exhibited neither anger nor pride, only bureaucratic proprietorship. "You served well, James," Colonel Armistead remarked, reviewing the paperwork from the military that acknowledged James's use by General Lafayette. "The French Marquis speaks highly of your fidelity. That is good for the credit of the plantation. But the war is over now. The tobacco needs tending. Get to the fields." Armistead viewed James's espionage as merely a temporary loan of an asset, akin to loaning out a horse or a wagon. The incredible, world-changing depth of James's double-agent work was reduced to a footnote in the ledger of plantation assets. The Virginia Act of 1883. For the next 2 years, James worked the fields, the knowledge of the victory he orchestrated burning inside him. He was a hero in chains. He knew Washington's strategy, he knew Lafayette's honor, and he knew the full, terrible irony of his position. His hope rested in the whispers circulating among the enslaved community that the Virginia Assembly was considering a law to grant freedom to those who had served in the Continental Army. In 1783, the Virginia General Assembly passed an Act to Emancipate Sundry Persons, a law intended to grant freedom to slaves who had served as soldiers or sailors during the war. Upon hearing the news, James immediately approached Colonel Armistead, carrying the quiet, unwavering conviction of a man whose service was beyond question. "Sir," James began, his voice firm but respectful, "the General Assembly has passed an act granting freedom to those who served the cause. I believe my service as a spy and courier for General Lafayette qualifies me." Colonel Armistead regarded him with a cold, legalistic eye. He retrieved a printed copy of the act and pointed to the specific clause. "Read it, James," Armistead said, tapping the specific clause. "The act grants freedom to any slave who served in the character of a soldier, sailor, or wagoner. You were not a soldier, James. You did not carry a musket for the Continental line." "But I carried vital information, sir. I was directly serving Lafayette and Washington, right up to the day of surrender," James pleaded, the frustration of 2 years of silence finally boiling over. "My service was military. It was far more important than loading a wagon." Armistead shook his head, the picture of infuriating, unyielding legalism. "The law is specific, James. You were officially listed by the British as a guide and courier, and by the Americans as an intelligence source. You did not bear arms, nor did you march in the ranks. The law does not cover the character of a spy." The legal loophole. The reality was crushing. The law, drafted to reward those who performed conventional military duties, contained a devastating blind spot for the unconventional, high-risk work of espionage.
A simple wagon driver was free. The spy who defeated Cornwallis was still legally a slave. Furthermore, Armistead, fearing the loss of valuable property, had an additional legal defense. The Act of 1833 had a separate clause designed to free slaves who had defected to the British in response to Lord Dunmore's proclamation, provided they were later captured by the Americans. Armistead pointed out the irony. "You defected to the British, James, but you did so under Lafayette's orders. You were never a true fugitive, therefore you cannot be freed under that clause either. You are simply property that was loaned for the war effort, and now must be returned." James stood before his master, the full weight of the new republic's hypocrisy settling upon him. He had faced down the British Army and survived their interrogation. Now he faced a piece of paper, a legal loophole, and the cold self-interest of his owner. His only hope now lay far away across the Atlantic with the one man who had looked him in the eye and guaranteed his freedom, the Marquis de Lafayette. James knew he had to reach the French general before the promise, like the scent of gunpowder, completely faded from the new nation's memory.
The plea across the ocean. The legalistic dismissal of his service by Colonel Armistead solidified one terrifying truth for James. His fight for freedom would not be won in Virginia's tobacco fields, but in the aristocratic halls of the Old World. His only champion with the moral authority and the legal standing to counter the Virginia Assembly's loophole was the Marquis de Lafayette. But Lafayette had returned to France immediately after the war, receiving the adulation of his own countrymen as a hero of two worlds. The Atlantic Ocean was not just a vast body of water, it was an insurmountable barrier for an enslaved man in New Kent, Virginia. The letter and the risks. James knew he could not simply write a letter and trust it to the erratic postal system. Any letter from an enslaved person seeking manumission would be immediately intercepted and destroyed by a magistrate, or worse, by Colonel Armistead himself. He needed an intermediary, a free man of unquestionable patriotism and integrity who was traveling to France to establish new commercial contacts for tobacco and rum. James, pooling the meager coins he had earned from small side tasks over the years, managed to purchase the paper, ink, and a new seal. He wrote the letter late at night by the dim light of a tallow candle, his words careful, formal, and deeply emotional. The letter was not a plea for charity. It was a factual recounting of the contract. To the most honorable Marquis de Lafayette, General in the Continental Army, etc., etc. Sir, you assured me, on the honor of a soldier, that my service in the character of a double agent at Yorktown would be rewarded by manumission. I followed your orders perfectly, providing the intelligence that allowed General Washington to maneuver successfully. However, I find myself now returned to the service of Colonel Armistead. The Virginia Act of 1783 does not account for the role of a spy, excluding me from the benefit granted to soldiers and sailors. The contract for my liberty, sir, rests solely on your confirmation of my character and my service to the cause of liberty. I beg you, sir, do not allow the cause of freedom to deny liberty to the man who delivered the surrender. Your devoted and obedient servant, James Armistead. He sealed the letter and delivered it to the trader along with the last of his coins as a promise of further reward upon its delivery to the Marquis's hands in Paris. The agony of waiting. The letter sailed for weeks across the dark Atlantic, while James was left in the stifling, routine oppression of the plantation. The waiting was agony. Every day James performed his duties, but his mind was 3,000 miles away, visualizing the moment Lafayette would break the seal and read his plight.
The return journey of the traitor, or any reliable news from France, would take a minimum of 6 months, and likely much longer. James had to appear completely resigned and docile to his master, Colonel Armistead, who watched him closely, suspicious of any deviation from the post-war norm. He relied on the memory of the private handshake with Lafayette at Yorktown, the quiet nod from Washington, and the magnitude of the secret he shared with those great men. That memory was the only shield protecting his sanity. Finally, 9 agonizing months after the letter was dispatched, the same Virginian traitor returned. He brought no written reply from the Marquis, which was perhaps a prudent move to protect James. Instead, he brought a short verbal message. The Marquis received the letter. He remembers the promise. He has initiated the required action. He will personally see to your freedom. The action Lafayette took, however, was not a simple letter of endorsement. The Marquis, recognizing the severity of the legal loophole and the political delicacy of overturning a Virginia law, decided that nothing short of his personal, powerful intervention would suffice. He planned to return to the United States. James's freedom would become a national diplomatic event.
The French general's ultimatum. In the summer of 1784, 3 years after the victory at Yorktown, the Marquis de Lafayette returned to the United States. His visit was a national sensation, a grand tour, where the hero of 2 worlds was hailed in every major city. But Lafayette had one non-negotiable item on his agenda, a personal matter of honor that eclipsed all the parades and speeches: James Armistead's freedom. Lafayette's tour culminated in a visit to Virginia, the state whose defense he had masterminded and whose legislature was holding James hostage through a legal loophole. He did not go straight to Colonel Armistead. Instead, he marched directly into the Virginia General Assembly in Richmond. The Assembly confronted. Lafayette's appearance before the Assembly was a calculated performance. He did not make a political speech about slavery. He delivered a direct military deposition concerning a matter of national security and his personal honor. He began by thanking the Assembly for their support, then swiftly shifted tone. He recounted the perilous state of the war in 1781, emphasizing how the intelligence he received from Agent X was the single most critical factor in anticipating and trapping Cornwallis. "Gentlemen," Lafayette stated, his voice ringing with aristocratic authority that few Virginians dared challenge, "the man who gave us the keys to Yorktown now finds himself in chains, not by the will of the king, but by the oversight of your own laws. I speak of James Armistead." Lafayette presented the core of his legal argument, meticulously detailing why James qualified for manumission even if the law was flawed. Direct military command. James's service was not a civilian act. He operated under direct military orders signed by Lafayette himself. Double agent status. James was not merely a spy. He was a double agent who risked not only his life, but was actively delivering false intelligence to Cornwallis to draw him to Yorktown. His role was paramount to the strategic victory. Honor of the Republic. If the new republic cannot honor a contract for freedom made to the man whose actions secured its very existence, then what is the value of your promise of liberty to the rest of the world? The Certificate of Character. Lafayette then produced his masterstroke, a document he had drafted and signed immediately before sailing from France, a formal certificate of character. It was not a legal document granting freedom, but an official military endorsement from one of the most respected generals of the war. The certificate was presented to the Assembly and stated unequivocally that James Armistead's services were essential, voluntary, and performed with fidelity and zeal, far exceeding the typical role of a soldier or sailor. Furthermore, Lafayette requested that the Assembly pass a special legislative act to remedy the oversight in the 1783 law, freeing James not as a matter of charity, but as a recognition of his strategic service. The triumph of principle. The pressure was immense. To deny Lafayette's request would not only be a slap to the French alliance, which was still vital, but would also cast a dark shadow on the integrity of the nascent republic's founders. Washington himself had praised James. Colonel Armistead, who was present, made a weak argument about the financial loss of his property, but his voice was drowned out by the powerful moral and political force of Lafayette's address. On December 24, 1786, the Virginia General Assembly relented. They passed a special act to grant James his freedom, citing Lafayette's testimony as the overriding evidence. In early 1787, James finally received the manumission papers. He was not just free, he was freed by a special act of the legislature, confirming his unique and indispensable service to the nation. To commemorate his two great heroes and the immense debt he owed them, James made the powerful decision to legally adopt a new surname. He took the name of the man who risked his reputation to fight for his liberty, James Armistead Lafayette. He was no longer property. He was a free man, a farmer in Virginia, and a silent, unheralded hero of the American Revolution. The promise made on the battlefield had finally been fulfilled in the legislative halls. The legacy of the free man. Epilogue. With the special act of the Virginia General Assembly and the adoption of the name Lafayette, James began his life as a free man in 1787. He was 32 years old, and after decades of toil, secrecy, and legal struggle, he finally possessed the one thing he had risked his life for: liberty. He immediately purchased 40 acres of farmland in New Kent County, near the very plantation where he had been enslaved. He worked the land diligently, turning his hard-won acres into a self-sufficient farm. This land was not just property, it was a physical manifestation of his dignity, a stark rejection of the system that had tried to define him as chattel. The ongoing connection. The relationship between James Armistead Lafayette and the Marquis de Lafayette was not a brief wartime connection, but a lifelong bond of mutual respect. In 1824, nearly 30 years after the surrender, the Marquis returned to the United States for a grand tour, a celebration of the remaining founders and heroes. The reunion between the French nobleman and the former slave was deeply emotional and publicly significant. During a stop in Virginia, James, now an elderly and respected freeholder, traveled to meet his old commander. Lafayette, still recognizing his friend and spy after all those years, embraced him warmly. It was during this reunion that Lafayette made a gesture that cemented James's name in history. He had his portrait painted in Washington, D.C., and in the finished piece, Lafayette is depicted with James. More importantly, Lafayette personally ensured that James Armistead Lafayette's name was included in the official records and correspondence recounting the victory at Yorktown, validating his crucial contribution to the nation. A quiet life and a powerful precedent. With the special act of the Virginia General Assembly and the adoption of the name Lafayette, James married and raised a family on his New Kent farm. He lived out his remaining years as a quiet, respected member of the community, but his story, the slave who successfully tricked Lord Cornwallis, began to circulate quietly through the generations. He became a powerful living example that demonstrated the hypocrisy of the early republic.
His existence proved that a black man could possess the intelligence, courage, and moral commitment necessary to save the very nation that sought to deny him his rights. His case, where an act of assembly was required to free a double agent, set a legal precedent that, while not immediately ending slavery, was used by abolitionists for decades to come as undeniable proof of the enslaved population's worth and service. James Armistead Lafayette died in 1830, a quarter century before the Civil War would finally settle the question of liberty for all. He lived long enough to see the young republic falter on its ideals, but he never stopped representing the highest realization of those ideals. He remains the ultimate shadow general, the man whose clever lies and unwavering courage guided the largest army in the world into a trap, paving the way for American independence. His was the ultimate untold story of the Revolution, a tale of bondage, bravery, and the long, hard fight for a name. The end.